Well, thank you again for you all for being here for our first, I guess we'll call this a panel today. I want to introduce two of my, I would say that you are both now friends more than just guests. To my right, we have Dr. Karuna Chourey, who is Director of Plant Microbe Interactions at Mammoth Microbes. And when I first heard her speak and then I heard her title, I was all like, I want to learn everything you know. And so have been interviewing her every chance I could. To her left is also a good friend, Joshua Steensland. He is a longtime cultivator and now international cultivating consultant all throughout Canada and the Caribbean now, but he's an Oregon boy, so many of you probably know him as a local. So how we're going to go about this is I'm going to ask them a few questions about polyculture. And for anybody who's not familiar with polyculture, it's very simply the idea of interplanting and companion planting with your cannabis plants. So we're used to doing monoculture and just having soil or hydro underneath our plants. But this idea is that we're going to plant other plants with them for the better benefit of further everybody. So this first question, I'm going to start with Joshua, if you would answer first, and then Karuna, if you want to pick up after that. So our first question is, in what ways does polyculture companion planting benefit cannabis health that monoculture does not?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Shango. First off, I'm really, it's an honor to be here and share the stage with you. And so anyway, polyculture, what I've noticed in my gardens is just kind of it's hard to quantify health benefit. You really, we've noticed a lot less pest pressure. The soil health is more vibrant, and the plants really show that in the end. You get the finished product is just different. I had cultivated conventionally for 15, 16 years previous to switching to living soil, and didn't even really think of it as polyculture. I was just companion planting and putting things in to help retain soil moisture and add nitrogen, and I just noticed that at the end my plants just looked incredible, and that was the biggest selling point to me, is the kind of the proofs in the pudding moment.
You said that you companion planted to help with moisture retention. Why don't you break that out a bit?
Sure. I mean, typically in regular, garden situations where you have bare soil, you're clearly going to be losing a lot of moisture to the atmosphere and transpiration. And any way you can kind of lock in that moisture is a benefit. Sometimes people do it with mulch. That's a really common thing, straw or bark chips or whatever. But I really liked the idea of using live plants that interact with the rhizosphere and enrich the soil microbiology and retain moisture at the same time. It's just kind of a win-win.
Yeah, well, I've heard you describe it before as like creating a little rainforest below your plants. That's just, it's just creating this like smaller moisture cycle. So Karuna, same thing to you, since you are approaching this less as a cultivator and more as a diehard plant scientist. What do you see as the advantages from polyculture versus a monoculture?
So when you talk about polyculture, basically what you're doing is you're introducing many different kinds of plants along with cannabis. What we are introducing here is diversity. And as we all know, diversity is always good. With monoculture, you are basically providing the nutrition. You are providing moisture. You are providing pest control. You're doing everything on your own. But when you have a polyculture, you have all the different members in that farm or in that grow that take care of all these different aspects, and basically you're going to be hands-off. Plants that are grown in such diverse environment are more healthy because they kind of get all the nutrients on demand. They are all communicating with each other. We have spoken about this many times before, is beneath the ground, you have the roots and they're constantly communicating with each other. If there is just monoculture, they're only going to be talking one language. You are introducing many different kinds of plants. Now they're going to be talking different languages. They're all capable of doing different things. And that leads to a plant which is more healthy because it gets the right nutrition at the right time, correct moisture, and also these plants can fend off pests better than what a monoculture can. And so in all aspects, having a polyculture is the way to go. it's the best way to go.
It sounds like what you're describing is a situation where, when you have a monoculture, you only get the know-how of the cannabis plant, but if you're adding all these other types of herbs, they all do their own jobs, and they're all providing different types of foods to the microbes in the rhizosphere. And so what you've got is a greater diversity of folks making short work of a complex array.
That's correct. And I have seen few grows where they have not introduced a different plant per se. They are still growing cannabis, but they have different cultivars in there. So some cultivars are susceptible to pests, some are not. Some are more efficient in nutrition utilization. And in those grows, I have seen that there might be some plants that might be infested with powdery mildew, but rest of the grow is completely free of powdery mildew. So here is your completely organic style farming, just because you decided to go a polyculture way rather than just grow one cultivar in a grow facility.
Fantastic. So Joshua, the two of you would be attracted to companion planting and choosing of the plants in different ways, right? Karuna might be coming at it from a scientific level because she knows the specific botany of other plants. You have, over your multiple decades of experience, have been choosing them more from your intuition, right? So I'm curious from both of you, how best can all of us, from folks who are home growing as patients in tents, or all the way up to folks who are watching who are scaling commercial. What's the best way to go about choosing the specific plants that we're going to install into our polyculture?
Oh, sure. I think if you went kind of my route, which is just throw anything at the beds and see what happens, is what I've just kind of done, and have not been afraid to throw anything in my beds. And as I learn and as I observe, and we're learning things like mustard and potentially broccoli. Like when those leaves break down, they could actually have a negative effect on the fungal components in the bed. So once again, it speaks to diversity. If you just had all of those as your companion plant, if mustard was it, man, you're really setting yourself up there. So I just kind of throw things at the beds, and whatever makes it, whatever doesn't. And that's the route I've taken, and so far so good. So, I think don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to just experiment. And like we've spoken on, diversity is the key. So if one thing out of the 12 or 13 or 20 things you have in your bed isn't working, it's not such a big deal. You don't have a nightmare on your hands.
So the one companion plant you mentioned was actually one that you don't recommend. Can you easily just recommend 3 for folks that if they just go and they plug into their soil is sure to be a win?
Yeah, absolutely. Comfrey is huge. It's a great dynamic accumulator. And when you leave it in the beds and allow the leaves to cycle the nutrients back in, it takes nutrients that were previously unavailable to the plant, rearranges them into a plant available form, and when those leaves get mulched back in, it's incredible for your growth. So definitely comfrey is huge. Any of the nitrogen fixers, we were talking a little bit about clover and thrip pressure and all these other things. So clover's all right. You don't want to do a whole lot of it or just be prepared for thrips. But clover's great. Legumes are great. Nitrogen fixing things are really good. So, I like comfrey, clover, nitrogen fixers, and ryegrass. The grasses are really nice. They do a really good job at creating a dense mat for that moisture retention. And then when they die off in cannabis, we get during your 2-month or 3-month flowering cycle, depending on what you got going, what's underneath the canopy will die off. And lots of times those are my decisions on what stays. As if it just didn't make it through the die off, I'm not too concerned about it. I'll replant something else.
I want to pinpoint one thing on there for anybody who's been following polyculture or may have heard Joshua on the Shaping Fire podcast. Folks are talking about now that clover may not be the best because it attracts thrips, and that of course really disappointed me because that's what I used this year already, and so now I have to pull out all the clover. But I'm hearing a slightly different message from you today, which is clover is okay in very small moderation. So will you kind of clarify that for me? Because I thought we were not using clover at all anymore.
Well, I think I was just mainly speaking to the diversity part, that if you had I think a little bit of clover is okay, because if you're planting other a diverse network of companion plants, we were just talking about this before coming on, that pest pressure that might be present from the clover can be mitigated by the attraction of beneficial insects from your other companion plants. So you really up your ante by having that diversity. So if you were all clover or 50% clover, you're gonna have a battle on your hands. Whereas if you have 5% clover, you're still gonna get nitrogen fixing. You're still gonna have diversity in the rhizosphere. And I think that pest pressure is gonna be less of an issue.
Right, I think that idea of don't put a monocrop under your monocrop is a good idea, right? So whatever you're gonna put under your monocrop so it's not a monocrop, make sure that it's diverse so you have polyculture. Nice. So Karuna, your approach is entirely different, right? You are thinking about what's going on in the rhizosphere and targeting specific plants because of your botany, and because you're involved with studies, it's a lot more expensive for your mistakes or your, if you find something that doesn't work. So how do you go about choosing plants that you would want to do a polyculture with?
So when you're trying to go with a polyculture, you have to first decide what is it that you need the polyculture for. Are you trying to plant things to get rid of pests, to attract beneficial insects, or you're just doing it for the nutrition cycling? Clover is an excellent example. It is very good at nitrogen cycling, so you want clover. At the same time, yes, it can repel thrips, but if you have high humidity, it can actually introduce powdery mildew in your grow. So be very careful. So you have to be aware of what is it that you want to have in your grow. For most of the grow that we have, it's indoors. So pest pressure is low to begin with. So I would basically look for anything that can be helpful in nutrient cycling. So many of the plants, like you have alfalfa, you have clover, you have many of them that can cycle not just nitrogen, they can cycle calcium, they can cycle sulfur. You want to have those kind of plants in your grow facility. So while you are providing your NPK fertilizer and other fertilizers, these plants are communicating with the cannabis plants and providing what they need in proper amounts. So that is for nutrition cycling. If you want to plant some marigolds, it's very nice. It will always get rid of all your other pests. So you have a really organic garden, pest-free garden. So what you want to plant depends on exactly what you want to do. So that's my way of looking at it. If you really have a lot of pests in your area, you go for something that can get rid of them. Go for alfalfa that can attract ladybugs, so you can take care of your spider mites. So it's just that mix and match the best way. Clover is good, but again, as a warning, I mean, if you are living in a place where there is high humidity, unfortunately, clover can attract powdery mildew, so you may want to go for plants that are a little bigger and not trapping much of moisture. So look at your environment. Look at what is native. That is another thing I should point out is just because we say clover worked well or particular plant worked well in Portland, Oregon, does not mean it will work well in Fort Collins, Colorado, or it might work well in Florida. So you will have to look around what plant is present in your surroundings. Go for the native ones because they know how to live, how to thrive in that environment. So just be aware of what you're looking for in your polyculture.
And that goes doubly so if you happen to be using native soils too, because as we know, microbes are bioregional, right? You're going to have different microbes that are occurring in Colorado than we have here in Portland. And so, choosing companion plants that are local will probably interact with the microbes more successfully. So Karuna, you said that, marigold is a good example of something that will repel pests,
Yes.
right? I'm a big fan of using beneficial insects, right? And so will the marigolds also repel my beneficial insects and have them leave the neighborhood?
So quite often when you have these plants that have got a lot of flowers, lot of pollen, they will attract many of your predator bugs that can get rid of your pests. And one reason being is that you need to have plants which have got a lot of flowers. You have marigolds, you have gerbera daisies, because they can offer pollen. So when you have your predator mites or predator insects that can take care of a pest, what if you don't have pests? These guys still need to feed on something. And so their source of protein for them then becomes pollen. So having these kind of flowering plants in your grow is definitely beneficial because they can provide some sort of food source to your predator bugs, which are keeping your grow pest-free.
One more follow-up on that before we move on. So you were saying that choose the particular plants that you want for particular jobs, and then determine how much pest pressure you're going to have, and choose based on that. Are there also plants that are negatively allopathic instead of positively, like plants that we might choose as a companion plant, which actually doesn't play nice with cannabis?
There are many plants, especially the ones that kind of grow tall. You don't want them because then they are going to take away all the sunlight that your cannabis is supposed to is to get. So definitely look for plants that are shorter than your cannabis plants. Don't look for plants that require like very high maintenance, like if you're going to plant roses. Well, they look nice, but you are spending more time now supporting the rose than your cannabis. You don't want to do that. So look for plants that are low maintenance. They are shorter in growth compared to your cannabis, and that way you can assure that your plants are healthy, your cannabis is getting all the benefits. Keep the focus on cannabis, not the companion plants, but you need the companion plants. Do I make sense?
Yeah,
So
for sure, for sure. And it's really easy to get distracted by your companion plants, because I've had the cannabis plants in my gardens for years, but now that there's companion plants, not only is it more beautiful, but they're plants that I'm not as familiar with, right? And as we all know, growing cannabis is a gateway to horticulture, right? And so now that I'm growing my cannabis plants and having some amount of success, now I'm all interested in these other companion plants, which again, most everybody else is also calling weed, right? So it seems like all the plants I'm interested in are all weed, one way or another.
That's correct.
So one of the challenges with polyculture in getting it adopted by people is people are all like, it doesn't work for commercial. It doesn't work for scaling. We can't do it. It takes too much labor. You've got to get too much education. I've heard all of this stuff. But then I see Joshua's Instagram, right? And I'm seeing these beautiful commercial rooms that are companion planted, kicking out these fantastically yielding plants and flowers. So Joshua, tell us a little bit about that. Help me dispel the myth that polyculture is not for commercial scale.
Yeah, I think there's we're battling kind of an old way of thinking when it comes to just agriculture in general, and we're really fighting that kind of monoculture mentality. And so lots of people just don't really understand that it's just as simple as what I described earlier. It's as simple as just throwing stuff in there and seeing what works. And that at scale, you're not really adding much labor, because you're just scattering seed or planting, a plant here or there, and your observation doesn't really change much. So at scale, it's not an issue we've found, and the benefit of the healthier beds and the healthier system in general is just worth that extra effort, and maybe worth some of the anxiety you might have with investors, or if you're working for an owner, that they might not understand those things. And the really other common questions are like, aren't they taking nutrients, and aren't they robbing nutrients from the soil? And so a lot of these things, people just need to be reassured that there's a process in place, and it doesn't really require a lot of interaction on our part.
It's funny that you would mention the investors or the owners, because that's exactly where I was going to go next. We probably have a lot of cultivators in the room, folks who are just patients like me who just have a few plants. But I know that there are commercial cultivators in the room that are responsible for a lot of lights, right? So as a commercial cultivator who has had to turn on your investors to this, right? What do you recommend as being the best argument to take to the owners on why they should do this radical thing?
Yeah, I think, fortunately, I have a body of work to reference from my home grows, and so I've got several years. I've got beds that are 4 years old, so I have a little bit of a reference point that I can bring them product from my grow, and just really talk with them and get them comfortable with the idea that there's a natural process at work here, and that we really don't maybe not need to necessarily fully understand it to implement it. And that's kind of a scary statement to say to people who have hundreds of thousands of dollars into a project, but just I have such confidence in that natural order that it's a really easy sell.
Now, Karuna, I know that for you it is all about analytics and spreadsheets, right? And so you look with very close awareness on what is actually happening in the plant. So from your perspective, how do you explain to people how polyculture is increasing yields, and if there is more labor, it's well worth it?
That's a very good question, and that is something that comes to the top of everybody's mind who wants to go to polyculture. They're like, are you not adding more plants, which means that you need more water for irrigation, you need more fertilizers added. So I will go back and say first thing, you choose a plant that is not going to be as demanding, so go local. What can thrive in your local environment is something you go choosing for. As I said, don't go plant roses. They are really demanding. You don't want them there. So go for something that, again, classifies as weed. What do we talk about? We talk about dill. We talk about marigold. We talk about gerbera, daisies. We talk about lavender. Can you kill a lavender plant? No, I don't think so. They just thrive. They thrive. So you want a plant which is not going to be demanding on nutrition or your fertigation. What do you get in return from all that? Just look at that. Now these plants are going to be there. They are going to be cycling nutrients as per what your cannabis plants require. So you, in long term, are going to have really healthy plants which have gotten the right amount of nutrients at the right time. That's the first thing. Secondly, by introducing all these different plants, you're going to get rid of all the pests that you're thinking of, right? So no more spider mites, no more any other mites that are coming and troubling your cannabis plants. You don't have to use pesticides. We all are aware of the biggest problem that pesticides pose. I don't have to introduce the audience to that kind of problem. We all know, we are aware of it. So if you don't have any pesticide use in your grow, what you have is an organic bud, an organic yield completely. You are not going to be worrying about this pest management or use of pesticide anymore. And the plants in general are going to be so healthy. I have seen it with my eyes that you are finally going to have a very good yield, which is completely organic, pesticide-free, and it does not require as much nutrition and irrigation as people think. If you think you are going to require that much, you're doing something wrong. Go back and take a look at, can you change your companion plant and come back to a plant which is not as demanding.
I've experienced that myself. So I've just recently learned about polyculture from Joshua, actually, when we did our podcast episode on it. And so I decided, all right, let's do this. And so of course it gives you an excuse to buy more seeds, right? And who doesn't love a seed catalog, right? And so that was cool. And then of course I oversowed, so my companion plants were like, whoa. Luckily the cannabis is taller, so I'm in good shape there. But one thing that I noticed is being a novice grower, as I still consider myself, I have a tendency for my soil to go hydrophobic, right? And I think most of us have had that experience where you're gonna hand water and the water runs off the side of the pot and down the end and out the hole, and you're like, come on. And so when you companion plant, there's all these new entry points into the soil. Mm-hmm. So now when I water, it's not sliding down the side and going down the side of the pot. It's actually staying there, being held by the other plants, yes, and then soaking in. And for me, that was the quickest discovery, mm-hmm, I had, and my soil is so clearly, absolutely, healthier.
Absolutely.
So now you've both hit on something that I hear all the time. People say, all right, if I've got all these companion plants, though, they're stealing nutrition from the cannabis plant. And there's two different ways to address that. There's the actual soil amendments that can be expensive, yeah, that perhaps, mm-hmm, these plants are using. And then also, is it literally taking from the plant? So Karuna, let's start with you. Will you address the nutrition, whether or not you actually have to increase it, and by how much?
So whether do you have to increase nutrition? I'll go to that question first right away. No, I don't think so. And let me explain what goes on. So far we have been discussing what goes on the top when you're growing. So what is visual? What we are completely forgetting is there is a whole ecosystem down there in the soil. And each plant is quite capable of attracting its own set of microbes that it likes to play with. And these plant and microbes, they communicate with each other The microbes are very good at fending off root pathogens. They're very good at solubilizing nutrients. They're very good at providing enzymes and other metabolites that boost plant growth. And they don't steal from each other. Let me tell you that. If anything, they provide each other with healthy nutrients. So you have cannabis, which can attract its own set of soil microbes in its rhizosphere, and it's doing its job, but the next plant next to it has its own set of microbes that can provide a completely new set of metabolites that is now available to your cannabis plant. So at the end of the day, your cannabis plant is going to benefit from having any sort of diversity in the soil. These plants don't steal from each other, they actually enrich each other. So that's a very good case for having diversity in your group rather than just having a monoculture.
The way you describe it, I want to move in myself, right? That sounds like a community I want to be a part of. So Joshua, same kind of question to you, right? Because the science sounds believable, but in the end, it's all about, when the rubber hits the road, does this actually work? And you work every day in this kind of environment. So what are your experiences with nutrition and water and the potential from the companion plants to starve out the cannabis plant?
Sure. She pretty much nailed it clearly, and it's basically what I would add is that a properly amended soil or a properly amended garden is going to have plenty of available nutrient for everything there. And so I don't think of, say, my beets as taking nutrients from my cannabis. I think of the beets as taking nutrients from the nutrient pool. And then if I'm not taking those things out of the garden and leaving them and letting them cycle, then those nutrients are kind of staying there. There's no subtraction happening really when you take time into account. So diversity, of course, is key, and I think that just leaving the things in there to cycle those nutrients back, you're not going to experience a loss.
One thing that I didn't understand at first when I first planted my polyculture is that, being brought up NPK and just dump it on the plant and hope for the best, right? Once you realize that there are huge advantages to using a living soil and that we then choose to feed the soil instead of the plant, I think it's pretty surprising to realize that the microbes that are there that we're trying to support are actually making plant food. I found that I'm actually having to add less amendments and top dress after the fact because it's once I've revved up this engine, it's actually becoming self-replicating because the microbes are doing their jobs once you kind of get the pump primed. So Karuna, and I would like you to go into the science part. So go over my head at least and speak to the people who are more familiar with this. What is going on at the microbial level that is causing these microbes to excrete these foods that other microbes use? Give us a snapshot of how that works.
So as the plant grows, just in a single 24-hour cycle, the plant exudates are given up through its roots, right? So the plant, when it's doing its photosynthesis, it's making food, but at nighttime, it is going to let those exudate out from the roots. Now, those exudates, we might think, okay, it's an exudate, but that exudate is actually food for the microbes. It's basically saying, here is the food, and that food is so specific for a few microbes that they get attracted, and when they come to eat that food from the plant, in exchange, they are going to give the plant something which is going to be a metabolite, which is going to boost the growth in the plant. This is very cyclic. So you have different group of microbes doing different things throughout the day. So this is one set of microbes. Now you have second set of microbes doing the same thing with other plants. After you're done with harvest, you're saying, okay, now the plants are already gone. What do these microbes do? They don't perish. They are still there. What they are going to do is they're going to take the rest of the roots that are left there. They're going to decompose it. So they're going to take all the nutrients, they're going to break it down, and they don't get washed away. They're going to be there. So next time when you're going to start with your grow again, these nutrients are already available. And like you said, over the period of time, you have to use less and less and less of added fertilizer to get much better plant. You add less fertilizer, but you get much more healthier plants. So having microbial diversity in the soil is the key to having healthy grow. And the more different plants you have, the more different microbes you have in the soil, and that will keep your grow very healthy.
Fantastic. And also, that is a great time to plug no-till. Because as we've all realized, after you put all this effort into infusing all of this life into soil, and you're using less of your bottled nutrients, hopefully less and less of them all the time, eventually you end up with this beautiful living soil, and it smells good, and there's worms, and occasionally you'll get mushrooms, and that's all great. But then we were all brought up to get rid of your soil, sterilize the pots, and start with brand new soil. So Joshua, you are a big proponent of no-till, and you've got these great indoor beds that you just plant on again more and more. Would you break out what your growing cycle looks like when you are using no-till?
Yeah, it is incredibly simple. It's so simple that I feel guilty accepting praise at the end. It's really so simple. If you have your beds nurtured in such a way, you should be able to just plant your plants in, adjust the light cycle, and let it go. And we talked about this too, about just getting out of the way. There's so much happening that is independent of our involvement once we insert the plant into a healthy living soil, that meddling, it just brings variables. And variables, I try to avoid them like the plague. And so, I think living soil really enabled me to look at my cultivation practices and eliminate just a myriad of these variables that I was dealing with in the 15 or 16 years previous. So, I think no-till is one of those kind of buzzwords in the community right now, and for the most part, people understand it, but people really are having trouble wrapping their head around the fact that you really don't have to do anything, that you've got to kind of separate your ego and your kind of mad scientist self and just separate yourself from it and let that process play itself out and just observe. And that's what really has turned me on about no-till, and why I've kind of become evangelical about it, is it changed me in so many ways, and my cultivation style, and the quality of medicine and the quality of products that we see, and even just the quality of my produce at home when I switched, my vegetable garden to a no-till type regenerative system. It's hands down better.
I think you nailed it too when you said that, it's one thing to understand the definition of no-till, but another thing to believe it, right? Because it definitely sounds too good to be true, right? Because the labor savings is incredible. You're saving all this money on soil, and every time you do a new cycle, your soil's already primed and ready to rock, right? So let's talk real brass tacks here for a second. So you've got this no-till bed, and you've just harvested your cannabis plants, and you've got some amount of companion plants that are still going. What are you going to do next? Specifically, I want you to talk about root balls and stuff.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so you spoke earlier about as the beds mature, you need to add less and less dry nutrient and mineral content, and that's really true. Now, my beds at home are about 4 years old. I only re-amend them twice a year. Every other cycle. So if it's a re-amend period, I never re-amend with my cash crop, the cannabis, in the beds. I just I've been wanting to illustrate that cannabis can be grown with water only, with no other inputs, and you can get the whole cycle. You're not sacrificing yields, you're getting a better quality. So I don't do any kind of top dressing or re-amending during that cycle, and if it's an off cycle, I won't even re-amend. I'll just harvest the plants, cut the stalk at the root, at the soil level, and then just leave it. And as she described earlier, it just gets consumed by the soil biology. It cycles the nutrients that are locked up in the roots, and I just plant the new crop right next to the old one. And then after about 3 cycles, sometimes 2, it's just completely gone. There's nothing left.
It's so strange to see an old cut plant in the bed. It looks like, as somebody who I like to keep really clean gardens, it looks like heresy right there. That should be gone. And it takes a while to realize that nature's not clean. And when we see tree trunks and decaying plant matter, that's part of this whole cycle. Whereas I have traditionally wanted to clean it all up, but I think it's well to your point where we a lot of polyculture, well, heck, gardening at all is just getting our egos out of the way. Yeah. So this idea of, adding companion plants is fun, right? And so I'm curious to hear from both of you, how will the companion plants do in this environment as well? Because really, the companion plants are there to serve the rhizosphere and the cannabis plant, but it'd be really cool if they would, bloom or maybe even produce food. How are they going to, work on an 18:6 or so light cycle during veg that then gets shifted to 12:12? We know our favorite plant likes that, but I'm sure that some of the companion plants are like, whoa, So how should we think about that? Why don't you start, Karuna?
So this is kind of very funny, and I hear this question so many times about what will the companion plants do 12-12 cycle. So cannabis has been growing outside the grow for as many years as we all know. And if you look at any outdoor grow, it doesn't happen that the plant decides, okay, 12 hours, let's switch the light off, we got to bloom. That doesn't happen. So your companion plants are definitely going to adapt. If it is an outdoor grow cycle, they will be perfectly fine because it does not happen that the light is going to be switched off, right? Like what we do for indoor grows. In the indoor grow, again, your focus is on cannabis, not the companion plant. So when you switch the light, they might take a little bit longer to bloom, maybe, and that's perfectly fine because your focus is the cannabis, not your companion plant. Unless you want your, Gerbera daisy to bloom and you don't care about your cannabis, that's a different story. Then we cater to that population. But at any point, you focus on your cannabis plant and the rest of your companion plants will definitely adapt and it will not be a big issue at all.
Fantastic. Now, Joshua, I know that you've gone so far as to intermingled food plants, which I think that's great, to be able to get both smoke and food out of the same bed. Like we're talking about efficiencies here. So why don't you talk a little bit about that process and how you chose the foods and maybe make some suggestions people might want to try if they want to get stuff out too.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think when I decided to introduce food into the polyculture, it was mainly to diversify what the soil microbiology and the worms had access to. I try not to take much out of my beds for that reason. I like those nutrients to cycle back. And so my experience has been to really not consume much of anything and just leave it to the beds. I'm growing it for the soil microbiology and talking on the light cycle thing, I've had one particular broccoli plant that's been in my beds for 2 years and has never flowered. It's just constantly in this vegetative state, and I'm thinking that has something to do with the light cycle and maybe some of the diffused light. But back to your question, as I typically don't grow food for my consumption in the beds. It's basically just to kind of have a diverse array of things to go back into the soil.
And certainly, companion planting food is a whole lot easier if you're working outdoors too, right? Nicholas Mahmood down at Green Source in Wolf Creek, Oregon, he's by far the person I've seen that's done the best. I mean, under his companion plants, you've got beds of straw, and then under those he's got potatoes, and he's got artichokes coming up, and it's amazing because as he goes through and gives you a tour of the farm, he's also pulling out lunch, right? And I think it makes for a really unique experience, both reminding us that the cannabis plant is a naturally occurring plant. It does not have to be separate from nature. It is of nature, and also especially when margins are so tight here in Oregon, if you can also get lunch out of it, that's a win as well, right?
Yeah, I gotta say, I have the deepest respect for Green Source Gardens. They are literally the tip of the spear and a shining example of regenerative agriculture. And I think we all need to look to them as that example and try to emulate it as much as possible.
And I think it's important too. I always say Green Source and Nicholas because he's the guy that I interviewed, but his wife Elizabeth deserves just as much credit. It's their partnership together, bouncing things off each other, both of them educating and then bringing information back to each other and to Jesse, who's also on the farm. It's a real team effort, just like polyculture, right? So Karuna, let's finish up with you on a similar question. From the science side, if somebody did want to companion plant food, what should they look for in a plant that's going to thrive food-wise alongside cannabis?
Again, as I said, when you're going for your companion plant, focus should be cannabis, not food plant. So plant something that is going to be small and not going to be really tall. You don't want to be planting big style tomatoes, that require more care. So plant something that will be shorter than cannabis plant, will not take so much of nutrition. I mean, you don't have to keep fertilizing your companion plant rather than cannabis. So those kind of, any plant that fits that criteria and is quite local, can thrive in your local environment, go for that kind of food plant.
So we're thinking lettuces, radishes, what else?
You have lettuce, radish, alfalfa, of course, you don't eat alfalfa, but then that is a good one to have there. You have dill, you have basil, many of these herbs, they're very good. I mean, they look nice, they are very good pest repellents, and they also help with their shallow root system. They can hold on to soil, so you have less of erosion, less of materials kind of just washing out. What other plants can I think of right away? Mint is a very good one. I completely agree. Mint will also repel so many other pests that are present in your garden. So there are so many herbs. Herbs is something that you can never go wrong with. So that is the first thing that you go for. I know he does a lot of beets. I just heard from him and I was impressed about it. So yeah, beets, you can go for beets apparently. Anything that is below the ground or just a little bit above the ground, not competing for sun space with cannabis is preferred.
I love the idea that you went towards culinary herbs, right? Because I'm thinking, herbal plants and weeds, not something that I'm going to go and snip and go throw on some scallions and avocado with soy sauce, right? The idea of having an actual culinary herb garden below my plant sounds easy and delicious at the same time. So we're all for that. So it looks like that we are out of time. Please put your hands together for Dr. Karuna Chourey and Joshua Steensland. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.